My name is Dorothée Vaillancourt, and I am 63 years old, and I am recording this on a Tuesday morning in March, 6 weeks to the day after my father's body was carried out of the house on Morris River Road and taken to St. Joseph's in Smithers for the Mass he had specifically asked not to have, and which my brother Gilles arranged anyway because Gilles has never, in 58 years of living, understood the difference between what he wanted and what was being asked of him. I am sitting at my father's kitchen table. The recorder belongs to my friend Paulette, who teaches with me at the school in Houston, and who drove out here on Saturday with soup and bread and the kind of a steady silence that only women who have buried their own parents understand. And when she left, she said, "Dorothée, you should say it before the lawyers make it impossible to say anything." She was right. She usually is. So I am saying it. I have kept this for 31 years, which is when my father finally told me the shape of the full story, though I had understood pieces of it since I was 9 years old, and found the first footprints in the snow behind the woodshed. I am saying it now because the will has been contested, because a man named Fernand Arsenault, who is my father's cousin's son, and who visited this property exactly once in 1987, and left after 2 days because the silence made him nervous, has hired a lawyer in Prince George to argue that the will is the product of a diminished mind. And I want it on record, before any court hears from Fernand Arsenault's lawyer, that Henri Vaillancourt's mind was not diminished. It was, if anything, the most precise mind I have ever known. He wrote the will in his own hand at the age of 74, in the presence of 2 witnesses, and he knew exactly what he was writing. This is what I am telling the recorder. My father came to the Bulkley Valley in the autumn of 1947, when he was 20 years old and had $30, and a letter of introduction to a man named Ovi Plante, who ran a small trapline operation out of a settlement called Lac Maurice, 11 kilometers off the main road along a track that became impassable in March and again in June when the snowmelt turned it to soup. The letter was from my father's uncle in Rimouski, who had known Ovidie Plante in the war, and the letter said only that Henri was a steady worker who did not complain and could be trusted with a rifle. Ovid Plante read the letter, looked at my father for a long time, and said, "Can you cook?" My father said he could not. Ovi said, "You'll learn." That was the interview. My father slept in the equipment shed for 2 weeks, until a bunk opened in the main cabin, and by Christmas he had learned to cook beans and salt pork, and not much else, and Ovi Plante told him he was the worst cook he had ever known, but that he was right about the rifle, and he could stay. The settlement at Lac Maurice in those years was not large. There was Ovidie and his wife, Marguerite, who had come from Chicoutimi and who had made a kind of peace with the isolation that showed on her face as something quieter than contentment and something stronger than endurance. There was a man called Félix Bolduc who had 1 arm and who could do more with it than most men could do with 2. There was a young couple, the Arcans, who had arrived the summer before my father and who were expecting their first child that spring. There was a woman named Coralie Desrosiers, who was 41 years old and had been widowed the previous winter, and who had decided, with a practicality that my father said he found both frightening and admirable, that she would simply stay on and make herself useful rather than return to her family in Terrace, who had never approved of the marriage to begin with. These were the people of Lac Maurice. 7 adults, the Arcand baby, born in April of 1948 and named Hubert, and my father, who was the youngest of them by 12 years, and who learned, in those first seasons, what the bush actually was. Not the romantic wilderness of the books he had read in school, not a place of adventure, but a working environment with specific demands that could be met or could kill you, and which had no opinion about which you chose. Ovid Plant was the kind of man the bush produces in the second generation, meaning he had grown up in it and knew its arithmetic exactly, and he ran his trap line with the efficient patience of someone for whom the work was not dramatic, but simply what the years were made of. He was 53 years old when my father arrived, and he had no children of his own, and my father became, in some informal way that neither of them ever discussed directly, a kind of apprentice in the full sense of the word. Not just the technical skills, reading weather and ice, and the condition of an animal in a track, but the interior posture that the country required, which is a particular combination of alertness and surrender that my father said took him 3 full winters to learn. The first winter he was too alert, meaning he was afraid of the wrong things and confident about the wrong things, and Ovid corrected him without cruelty, but without mercy either. The second winter he found the surrender and briefly lost the alertness, which Ovid called the most dangerous stage, when a young man thinks he has learned the bush, and the bush has simply decided to wait. By the third winter, my father said, he understood that the country was not indifferent to him, but that its form of attention was not the form he had grown up expecting from human beings, and that the adjustment required was not of skill, but of assumption. He did not tell me any of this until I was older. What he told me when I was small was the short version, which was that he had come from Quebec to work, and had stayed because the country was beautiful, and because he had met my mother, Simone Arcand, who was Hubert Arcand's younger sister, and who had come up to visit in 1954, and had not gone back. That was the story I grew up with. It was true. It was simply not complete. The winter of 1952 was the winter my father was lost. He was 25 years old, and he had been running a section of Ovid's trapline alone for 2 seasons, which was normal. You learned the country by walking it, and by the second year, a young man was expected to handle his own section without supervision. The storm came in on the 14th of January, which my father knew from the way the spruce had been moving 2 days before, and he should have turned back earlier than he did. And he has told me this himself, not with guilt, but with the plain precision of a man reviewing what he got wrong. He was 4 hours from the main camp when the temperature dropped to something he said he did not have a number for, because his thermometer had stopped registering below 40 below, and the snow came sideways, and he lost the trapline trail in less than 10 minutes. He walked for what he estimated was 6 hours. He dug a shelter in the base of a windfall and got inside it, and he said later that he knew, at some point in the dark, that this was probably where he would end. He was not afraid when he said it. He said it the way a carpenter describes a joint that didn't take. He was not alone when morning came. He would not describe it fully to me until I was 32 years old, when he decided, for reasons he did not entirely explain, that I was ready to hear it. What he told me in the short version, when I was 9 and had found the footprints, was that something had kept him warm through the night and had led him back to the trail by mid-morning, and that it was large and dark-furred and moved through the snow as though the snow had no authority over it whatsoever. He said this without drama. He said it the way He said everything which was carefully and without ornament. I asked him if it was a bear, and he said it was not a bear. I asked him if it was a person, and he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, in a manner. I was 9 years old, and I understood that this was the end of the conversation, and I did not push it, because my father's silences had weight to them. And you learned early not to throw yourself against them. What he told me when I was 32 was this. He had woken in the windfall shelter to find the opening blocked not by snow, but by something living, something that had positioned itself against the entrance through the night, and whose body heat had kept the interior from reaching a temperature that would have stopped his heart. When it moved away from the entrance in the grey morning light, he saw it fully for the first time. He said it stood, when it rose to its full height, at something he estimated at 8.5 feet, and that it was covered in fur the colour of dark bark, and that its face was the part he remembered most precisely, wide-browed, deep-eyed, the eyes a dark brown that reflected the morning light, with the same quality he had seen in the eyes of old horses, which is to say, an awareness that was patient and untroubled and very old. It looked at him for what he thought was 2 or 3 minutes. Then it turned and walked north along a ridge line he had not been able to see in the dark, and it stopped and looked back at him once, and he followed it. And 2 hours later he was on the main trapline trail, with the camp 3 kilometers ahead of him, and his feet only slightly frostbitten and his hands intact. He said, and this is the sentence I have thought about for 31 years. It looked back at me only once, and in that one look I understood that it had been watching for longer than I knew. He did not tell Ovi Plante what had happened. He told no one for 7 years. What changed in 1959 was that Felix Bolduc saw it at the edge of the tree line on a May evening, and came inside and sat down at the table and said, in a voice that my father described as completely without agitation, Henri, there is something very large standing at the end of your woodpile. My father went to the window and looked out, and it was there, standing in the last of the daylight, and my father said, yes, he said, I know. And then he told Felix the story of the storm in 1952, and Felix Bolduc listened to all of it, with the single arm resting on the table. And when my father was finished, Felix said, it has been 7 years, and you have not told anyone. My father said, no. Felix said, what does it want? My father said he did not know, and that he had come to believe that want was perhaps not the right word for what it did, that it seemed instead to simply be present, at intervals, in the way the country itself was present, in a manner that did not require anything from him, except that he notice. Felix thought about this for a long time, and then he said, all right. He never raised the subject again, but he never treated my father differently either. And when Felix died of a stroke in 1974 at the age of 66, my father was one of the 4 people who carried the coffin, and my father said afterward that Felix Bolduc was one of the finest men he had known, which from my father was the equivalent of an extended eulogy. Between 1959 and 1963, my father saw it perhaps 8 times, not always close, sometimes only at the tree line, in the diminishing light of an autumn afternoon, a shape that was too large to be anything he had a name for, standing with a stillness that he said was unlike the stillness of an animal waiting to run, and unlike the stillness of a man trying not to be seen, but more like the stillness of something that had simply decided to be where it was, and had no particular need to justify that decision. Twice it came to the clearing directly. Once it left something on the chopping block, a flat river stone that had been placed with a deliberateness he could not account for, as if it had been chosen rather than deposited, and which my father kept on the windowsill above the kitchen sink for the rest of his life, and which is there now, grey and smooth and unremarkable to anyone who did not know the story. In those years my father also noticed a pattern in when it appeared, which is to say that its appearances were concentrated in certain seasons and around certain events, and never random in the way that a chance wildlife sighting is random. It appeared in the weeks following a hard winter, when the cold had been sustained long enough to drive game deep into the timber, and when my father's own work on the trapline was most demanding. It appeared in October, when the light changed and the birch went gold, and the property line became most clearly visible as a line between two worlds. It appeared twice in years, when my father was unwell, once when he had a chest infection that kept him inside for 11 days, and once after a trapline injury in which he broke 2 fingers on his left hand and had to walk 3 hours back to the property with the hand wrapped in his shirt. He did not conclude from this that it was watching over him in any conscious or deliberate sense, because he was not a man who imposed comfortable interpretations on incomplete evidence. What he said was, "There is a pattern. Patterns in the bush are information." I noted it the way I note any information about the country I am working in. That is what he said. But he said it with the particular quality of restraint that I had learned. By that point in my life, meant that the thing being described with restraint was the thing that mattered most to him. My mother Simone arrived in the summer of 1954, as I have said, and she and my father were married the following spring, in the settlement's one room that served as a chapel on Sundays and as a general meeting space the rest of the week, and the ceremony was performed by a priest who drove out from Smithers every third Sunday, and who was a practical man with a great deal of tolerance for the particularities of bush life. My mother was 22 years old, and she was from a family that had farmed in the valley north of Terrace, and she had the particular quality that my father's people seemed to share, which was that she paid attention to things before she spoke about them, and that she did not confuse her own feelings about a thing with facts about the thing itself. She knew something was different about Lac Maurice within the first winter. She told me, years later, that she had sensed a presence in the land around the property that she could not name, but that did not frighten her. She said it felt protective in the way that very old places sometimes feel protective, as if the ground itself remembered being looked after by something that had been there longer than memory. My father told her in their second winter together. He told her the way he told everything, which was completely and without editorializing, and she listened all the way through and was quiet for a while. And then she said, "Show me the stone." He brought it from the windowsill, and she held it in both hands for a moment. And then she set it back down and said, "All right." That was the whole of her response. I do not know what she made of it in the privacy of herself. She never told me directly, and my father said he never asked, because some understanding between people does not require the translation into words, and because he could see, in the way she moved through that country afterward, that she had made a peace with it that was hers alone. What I know is that my mother began her own practice, separate from my father's, of leaving things. Small offerings is not the right word, because neither of my parents were people inclined to ritual or performance. What my mother left were practical things, the same way she was practical about everything. She left a length of cotton cloth folded on the woodshed step. One February morning, good heavy cotton that she had cut from a bolt she had been saving for a quilt, and when she told me about it, 20 years later, she said she had simply thought, "It is cold, and this is something I have that I can spare." She left a jar of preserved plums one autumn, the same plums she put up every September from the tree my father had planted in 1950, and she said she had thought, "We have enough." She never saw these things taken. But by morning they were gone, and she continued the practice quietly and without comment for the remaining 40 years. She lived on that land, and after she died in 1994, which was the year after my father wrote the will, my father continued it himself until he was too old to manage the steps to the woodshed in the dark. My brother Gilles was born in 1956, and I was born in 1961, and we grew up on that property the way children grow up anywhere, which is to say, surrounded by the specific details of a particular place, and largely unaware that those details were not universal. The smell of the wood stove, the sound the creek made in April when the ice began to move, the way the dog, a red tick hound my father called Silas, would sometimes go to the kitchen door at dusk and sit very still with his ears slightly forward, and not bark, just sit and attend to something outside that we could not hear. Silas was not a nervous dog. He was not a dog that startled. When he sat at the door like that, my mother would glance at my father, and my father would nod very slightly, and sometimes he would open the door and look out, and sometimes he would not. But neither of them ever explained to me or to Gilles what the dog was attending to, and it was not until I was 9 and found the footprints that I began to understand. The footprints were in the snow behind the woodshed, a series of impressions that I remember now with the precision of something I have examined many times in memory, each one roughly the shape of a very large human foot but wider across the heel and deeper at the ball, and set apart from one another at a stride that would have required legs much longer than any man I had ever seen. I was 9 years old, and I had grown up in the bush, and I had seen every kind of animal track there was to see, and I knew what these were not. They were not bear, not moose, not anything in the categories I had learned. I stood there for a while in the cold looking at them, and then I went inside and found my father, and he came out and stood beside me and looked at them with me, and that was when I asked him if it was a person. And he said, in a manner, and then the silence came down. I am 63 years old, and I have spent 31 years with the full story, and 24 years before that with pieces of it, and I want to say clearly that I was never afraid. Curious, yes. In the years before my father told me everything, I sometimes felt at the edge of the property at dusk the kind of awareness that I imagine a child feels when they know an adult is watching over them. From a window, a sensation of being held in a larger attention than the visible world. It was not frightening. I want to be precise about this, because I know what people assume when they hear the word large, and the word dark, and the word watching. They assume threat. I am telling you it was not threat. It was its opposite. My father began leaving things for it in the early 1960s. Not food, he said. He felt that food would have been condescending, as if the creature needed his help to eat, which, given the country and the evidence of its capabilities, was plainly absurd. What he left were small things, chosen with a care I understand now, was a kind of courtesy. A smooth piece of birch bark he had peeled and dried, a length of braided cordage he had made that winter. Once a small carved figure of a spruce tree that he had made with his knife on a long January evening and had left on the woodshed step. He never saw it taken, but in the morning the things were gone, and once, only once, something was left in return. A section of spruce root that had been stripped and braided into a tight, even braid, perhaps 18 inches long, a technique he said he had never seen and could not replicate himself. He kept it in the drawer of his work table, and it was there when we cleared his things after he died, and I have it now, the will. I should say what the will actually contains, because the newspapers in Smithers have been describing it in ways that are not accurate, and because Fernand Arsenault's lawyer has characterized it in ways that are designed to suggest confusion where there was none. My father wrote his will in the autumn of 1993, when he was 74 years old and in full possession of himself, and he had it witnessed by Coralie Desrosiers, who was by then 84 years old and still living in the valley in a house her late husband had built, and by a man named Thomas Archie, who had been my father's neighbour to the east for 20 years, and who was a man of considerable legal literacy because he had spent 15 years working as a land surveyor before he retired to Morris River Road. 2 reliable witnesses, a clear hand. The will disposed of the house and its contents to my brother Gilles and to me in equal shares, which was straightforward. It disposed of the trapline equipment to Thomas Archie's son, who had been using it with my father's permission for several years. And then there was the land itself, the 160 acres of the original homestead, claim that my father had held since 1954, the creek and the clearing and the dark wall of spruce and pine that pressed in from 3 sides, and which my father had never cleared beyond what was needed for the yard and the woodshed and the kitchen garden. He left the land to the valley. That is the phrase he used. To the valley, for the keeping of what the valley holds, and for the guardianship of those within it, who have no recourse to any other protection. Those are the words he wrote. And then he wrote, I name as guardian of this intention the one who kept me in the storm of January 14 of 1952, whose nature I cannot name, and whose wisdom I do not presume to describe, but whose presence on this land I have witnessed across 41 years, and whose claim to this country exceeds my own by a measure I am not qualified to calculate. He did not use the word Sasquatch. He did not use any word that could be looked up in a field guide or a legal dictionary. He used the pronoun the one, and he described a specific event on a specific date, and he made a specific legal bequest, and he signed it in the presence of 2 witnesses who knew exactly what he meant and who signed it anyway. I was not present when the will was signed. My father showed it to me the following Christmas, when I drove out from Houston for the holiday, and he gave it to me to read at the kitchen table and stood at the window while I read it. And when I looked up, he was still looking out at the yard. I said, Papa. He said, yes. I said, Thomas Archie signed this. He said, without turning, Thomas Archie has been my neighbour for 20 years, and he knew what he was signing, and he signed it because it is true. I said nothing more. I folded the will and gave it back to him, and he put it in the tin box on the shelf above the wood stove, where he kept the property documents. And we had supper and talked about other things, and I did not cry until I was back in my car on the Morris River Road with the dark timber on both sides and the headlights cutting a small passage through it. I cried because the will was the most precise and dignified thing I had ever read, and because it was also an act of courage that most people do not have the vocabulary to recognize as courage, and because my father was 74 years old and had been carrying this alone, mostly for 41 years, and the will was the first time he had put it into a form that would outlast him. He had not wanted a monument. He had wanted a fact in the record. That was who he was. Coralie Desrosiers signed it. She was 84 years old, and her hand was steady, and she told me, 3 weeks before she died in 1998, that she had signed it without hesitation because she had lived 50 years in that valley, and she knew what was in those trees, and she thought my father was the only man she had known who had the precision and the courage to put it into legal language. She said, he found a way to say it that cannot be argued with, because it is specific, and it is witnessed, and it is true. I have thought about that sentence for 26 years. Coralie was right. It cannot be argued with. It can only be misrepresented, which is what Fernand Arsenault's lawyer is attempting to do. I want to say something about what 41 years of this means. My father lived on that property from 1947 until his death 6 weeks ago, which is 76 years. For 41 of those years, from the storm in 1952 until he wrote the will in 1993, he was aware of a presence in the land around him that he could not explain and did not try to explain and did not, in the deepest sense, need to explain, because the experience of it was its own sufficient fact. He was a trapper. He was a man who trusted physical evidence and careful observation, and who distrusted conclusions that went further than the evidence warranted. He would have said, I think, that this was precisely the right approach to take with something that existed outside the categories he had been given. He did not call it a spirit. He did not call it a monster. He called it the one, in the will, and in private conversation with me he called it, simply, the one in the trees, and this was neither evasive nor mystical. It was accurate. In the winter of 1971, when I was 10 years old, Silas the hound died. He was 12 years old, which is a good long life for a working dog, and he had been slowing for 2 seasons, and one morning in February he did not get up from his spot by the stove, and my father sat with him for an hour before he came to find my mother and me, and I will not describe the afternoon that followed, except to say that my father buried Silas at the edge of the clearing near the spruce on the eastern side, and that he made a small wooden marker, and that for 3 consecutive mornings after the burial, my father found that a branch of spruce bough, fresh cut, had been laid across the grave. He showed me the first one. He said nothing. He picked it up and smelled it, and set it back down, and we stood there together for a moment in the cold, and then we went inside. He did not explain it to me, because he did not have an explanation, and because some things are acknowledged rather than explained, and the distinction between those 2 operations is one of the things I have been trying to teach in a classroom for 38 years with uneven success. Gilles does not know. I want to say this plainly because it is relevant to understanding the will. My brother Gilles is a good man. He is impractical and sentimental, and he organized the Mass for our Father against explicit instructions. But he is not a bad person. He simply did not inherit our Father's quality of attention. He grew up in the same house and walked the same land and felt nothing particular in those trees and found the footprints in the snow when we were children, and decided they were from a large black bear at an unusual angle, because that was the most available explanation. And Gilles has always preferred the most available explanation. Our father saw this about Gilles early and made his decision accordingly. He would tell me, and he would not tell Gilles, not out of secrecy, but out of a realistic assessment of what each of them would do with the information. My father was not sentimental, but he was fair, and fairness, in his understanding, sometimes required calibrating what you said to what the listener could actually use. Gilles is not contesting the will. I want to be clear about that also. Gilles and I are in agreement about the land, which is that it should not be sold, that it should be kept as it is, that the 160 acres and the creek and the dark timber should remain exactly as our father left them, and as his father's arrangement with the valley intended. It is Fernand Arsenault who is contesting. Fernand Arsenault, who visited once in 1987 and left after 2 days because the quiet made him uncomfortable. He has hired a lawyer to argue that my father was of diminished capacity when he wrote the will, because the only other argument available to him is to engage with the substance of what the will says. And that argument he cannot make, because the substance is a matter of witnessed fact, documented in my father's clear hand on the specific date of October the 3rd, 1993. I want to describe the last time I saw it. I know that I am using that word, it, when my father used the one, and I think that is my own inadequacy rather than a correction of his choice. His word was more accurate and more dignified, and I use it only because I am 63 years old and have not yet found my own word for what he found his word for. The last time I saw it was in September of 1999, 6 years after the will was written, and 28 years ago now, and I had driven out to visit my father for a long weekend, and we had spent Saturday walking the property line in a way that my father said he wanted, to do every autumn while he still could, noting where the fence posts needed attention and where the creek bank had shifted, and where a stand of birch had come in along the southern edge that had not been there the decade before. We were coming back toward the house in the late afternoon, the light going amber in the spruce tops, and my father stopped walking and put his hand out in a small gesture that, I understood, meant stop and be still, and I stopped and was still. And then I saw it. It was standing at the edge of the spruce on the eastern side, perhaps 30 meters from where we stood, fully upright, and it was larger than I had remembered, from the one time I had glimpsed it as a child, though I know that what I had seen as a child was only a shape at distance, and what I was seeing now was a clear view in good light. 8.5 feet, perhaps. My father had been right about that. Dark brown fur across the shoulders and back, the face turned toward us, the eyes finding us in the way that an old animal finds you when it has no reason to unhide and no need to flee. I had the sensation that it had been following our walk along the property line at a distance, in the trees, for some portion of the afternoon, and that it had decided, at this particular moment in the amber light, to be visible. It stood for what I think was 3 minutes. My father did not move and did not speak, and I did not either. Then it turned and was gone into the spruce, and the spruce simply closed behind it, the way the surface of water closes after something passes through. I have thought about that 3 minutes for 28 years. I have thought about what it means that it chose that afternoon, and that light, and that moment of my father and me standing together at the edge of his land. I have come to believe, though I hold this belief with appropriate uncertainty, that it was a kind of introduction, that my father, in some communication I was not present for and cannot reconstruct, had told it something about me, had told it, in whatever manner he had of communicating across that distance, that this one is mine, and she knows, and she will keep it. I do not know this, but I have thought about it for 28 years, and I have not arrived at a better account. My father did not decline slowly. He was a man who had managed his body the way he managed everything, with economy and attention, and until his 79th year, he was walking the property line every autumn and carrying his own firewood and keeping the kitchen garden in better order than I keep my desk. In his last years, he became quieter in the way that some very old people become quieter, not from dimness, but from sufficiency. He had thought what he needed to think and said what needed saying, and the rest he was content to leave alone. He told me, on the last Christmas I spent with him, that he was not afraid of dying, but that he wished he could know whether the land would be kept. I told him it would be. He looked at me for a moment with the clear, undecorated attention he had always given to things he wanted to measure accurately, and then he nodded, and I understood that the nod was not agreement but acknowledgement, which was a distinction he had always made precisely. The stroke that took him 6 weeks ago was sudden and serious, and he died within 36 hours of it, and I was there for the last 20 of those hours, in the hospital room in Smithers, and toward the end he was not entirely in the room with me any more. He was somewhere that I did not have access to, and I sat beside him and held his hand, which was large and scarred from 50 years of trapline work. And I did not try to call him back. I said to him, "Near the end, the land is not for sale, Papa." I do not know if he heard me. His breathing had the quality by then of something that was completing a long calculation and would not be interrupted. I said it anyway, because it was true, and because he had spent 76 years believing that true things deserve to be said clearly and in the presence of the person they concerned. What I want the record to show is this. My father was a man of exact mind and quiet authority, and he was not confused when he wrote his will, and he was not diminished. And the one named in that will, if named is even the right word, is real. He is real, and he is in those trees, and he has been in those trees for longer than any human claim on that land. And my father understood that, and honored it, and built his life around the understanding that the world is larger than the systems we have invented for recording it. The Provincial Land Registry has no category for what my father left that land to. That is a problem with the Provincial Land Registry, not with my father. Fernand Arsenault's lawyer has used the phrase delusional ideation. I want to speak to that phrase directly. My father saw what he saw. Félix Bolduc saw what he saw. Coralie Desrosiers saw what she saw. Thomas Archie, who witnessed the will, told me 2 years before his own death in 2019 that he had signed that document with complete understanding of its meaning and complete conviction that the meaning was true, because he had lived next to that property for 20 years and had seen things at the edge of his own land in the deep winter that he had no other word for. These are not credulous people. These are not people who wanted to believe in something larger than the ordinary world, because the ordinary world disappointed them. These are people who paid attention to the evidence and arrived separately and over long periods of time at the same conclusion. I have one more thing to say, and then I will stop. In the weeks since my father died, I have been staying at the house on Morris River Road, sorting through his things and making the arrangements that need making and sitting in the evenings in the kitchen, where he sat for 76 years. 3 nights ago, I heard Silas, which is impossible, because Silas has been dead for 52 years, and the dog I grew up with is buried under the spruce on the eastern side. But I heard the particular quality of stillness that Silas would produce when he went to the door and attended to. Something outside, a quality of stillness that is not the absence of sound, but the presence of listening. And I went to the door and opened it and stood in the cold in the dark. And I cannot tell you what I saw, because I am a woman who values precision, and I did not see enough in the dark to describe with precision. I can tell you what I felt, which is that I was not alone in that yard, and that whatever was not alone with me had been in that yard for a very long time and intended to remain. The land is not for sale. The will is not the product of a diminished mind. The one in the trees is real, and my father made his covenant with the valley in language clear enough for anyone willing to read it without contempt, and I intend to see that it stands. That is what I am telling the recorder. That is all I have to tell.